so pleased to be able to moderate this panel. I'm Professor Rose Brewer, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of African American and African Studies. I had the great honor and challenge of accompanying a group of black women to Cuba this past July. It was intergenerational. However, a disproportionate number of the attendees would be what we would call young black women. And we have 3 of those women with us today. And they're going to share some of their experiences. And we're going to open it up for some Q&A. I'm going to have to go to my 1 o'clock class, but I'm assuming if they have time, y'all can kind of stand around and have a conversation. But let's just get going. I'm going to start with some brief introductions. These are all accomplished women, and starting with Kalice Ayaan, who amazingly enough put together this delegation of, was it 15 women? 17 women. Did a fantastic job of that and led us to Havana. She is a graduate of St. Catherine's University. She graduated in 2017 with a degree in public health and a minor in critical race and ethnic studies. This was not her first time in Cuba. She traveled to Cuba in 2016, where she studied at the National School of Public Health. Since then, her interest in Cuba's healthcare system and curiosity of how the U.S. embargo, sometimes called the blockade, I think they're using that more regularly now, impacts the everyday lives of Afro-Cubans, and it has really been at the source of her curiosity about Cuba. And her desire is to continuing to explore parallels between Afro-Cubans and African Americans and to hold spaces of healing for black women. And this was the inspiration for her Kindred delegation to Cuba this past July. Welcome, Kalice. Next to Kalice is Ruby, and Ruby is one of our own. Ruby, pronounce your last name, I don't want to bungle it. Oluoch. And Ruby actually graduated last year from the University of Minnesota with a degree in global studies and a minor in business management. She studied at the University of Cape Town and wrote her honors thesis on the strategies and successes of Fees for All, and Fees Must Fall, a movement for the decolonization of higher education in South Africa. Her interest in decolonization and black international struggles moved her to travel with the Kindred delegation to Cuba. In her travels, she enjoys exploring arts and culture to understand the lives of black people. She works full-time as the communications project manager at the Women's Foundation of Minnesota and will be leading the Freedom Ideas Literary Circle through the fall. Welcome, Ruby. And last but not least, we have Ayaan Natala.
Ayaan Natala.
I knew I wasn't going to get it correct. Ayaan Natala. And she is a 2018 double major in American Studies and Political Science at Macalester College with a concentration in human rights and humanitarianism. Her writings are published in the Huffington Post and the Human Rights Observer, tackling global governance, social movements, and revolutionary political theory. She is a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow, Black Liberation Collective member, and a part of the Black Women's Wealth Alliance. Currently, she works at the Science Museum as a youth manager combining STEM and social justice. Welcome. I think we'll start off with each panelist giving their own very brief reflections of their sense of this this delegation, their sense of Cuba, and then we're going to do kind of a moderator panelist question and answer, where there's a series of questions that not every panelist has to answer, but if so moved, can answer those questions. So let's just start with you, Kalice. Just some general reflections for our audience here.
About
Cuba and
delegation.
yeah, and the delegation. Yeah.
So I think that, so this is my third time traveling to Cuba and leading this delegation. And just honestly, every time.
Can you all hear her, by the way?
I can
Her
talk
voice is a little
loud,
bit
sorry.
soft.
Every time I, travel to Cuba, I think that I'm going there to, like, for one thing or to learn this one thing, but just become so intrigued or like something else just involved over the trip. And so with this trip, I had, just one particular idea of what we would talk about, what our discussions would be, what would happen, and just with the group dynamics and with just all the amazing ideas and experience that people brought, it completely turned into something that I didn't quite expect. And so we'll talk about that a little later. We'll like go into more detail. That's just my general, like it was just not what I expected, but in a very great way.
And we want to get into more details.
Yes, we will.
Yeah, so this was my first time to Cuba, and I was really interested in the framing of a delegation that was centered in Blackness, but also health and wellness. That was sort of the theme of our delegation, and it was a really enjoyable trip. I really loved Cuba, but it was also very challenging, specifically when sort of grappling with Black identity in a Latin American context. I don't think that's something I ever seriously had done before, and definitely not in a place like Cuba that is so complex and that has such a rich Black history, and being there with a group of Black women who had a lot of different Black identities really challenged me in a way that I also didn't expect. So.
I feel like I went to Cuba, like if I'm being really transparent, for selfish reasons in terms of the state of my mental health, being a Black woman in the United States. And so just timing is everything. So I was just graduating undergrad in a predominantly white context, doing a lot of like Black radical work. And I think that, and also what was happening in the state of affairs in Minnesota, I think it was too much on my psyche. And so when I heard that there was an opportunity for Black women to come together, to come to Cuba and learn more about mental health, traditional medicine and untraditional like ways of healing, I wanted that to be on my own personal journey of healing, and then got really surprised with recognizing how political it was. So I think something that I've been really pondering is, like, as a Black person, I'm like really exhausted with always being politicized, and I wanted to like be in a space that allowed me to like not be Black but be human. And so in Cuba, that's where I was able to like exist in that, and it was really refreshing and overwhelming in a good way.
Okay. Well, series of questions to push y'all a little bit further. You're welcome to weigh in or not on them. But the first one is talk about your understanding of socialism before traveling to Cuba, and then after.
I guess I'll start to rotate it. So I feel like socialism is a buzzword, especially with the whole Bernie Sanders social phenomenon or whatever. But I think in terms of what I understood of socialism, I felt like I was too scared to like identify as a socialist, being a Black person, with this era of Black identity extremism under 45. And so I feel like it was something that like I would gravitate to, because a lot of people that inspired me identify with socialism or like have socialist principles, but I would never be like, I'm socialist. And then even with Bernie Sanders and thinking about socialism and like the political climate, it's weird how like even people, they'll say I'm a democratic socialist, or like there's still like a separation from just saying I'm a socialist. And so I think if I see whiteness already kind of scared to like claim that on, as a Black person, I'm not trying to claim that on. So I think that's like my own personal relationship with the term socialism. And then also, like Ruby, I went to South Africa and learned a lot from the student movement and got called out a lot with my Americanness, and it was a really good space to like reflect on that. I think in America we don't always think of alternative political like realities that we can live in, and so socialism kind of becomes like what we dream of and we romanticize it. And so I think in Cuba we got to really see like firsthand what it looks like, not as a dream but like in reality. So then it's no longer like, since we're in a capitalist society, socialism is the answer. It was like socialism can be an avenue, but socialism also comes with things. And so I think that was kind of what I got out of it.
Yeah. So I would say before going to Cuba, my understanding was pretty limited to, I guess, the stereotypes or the discourse we have in the United States around socialism, which is largely very negative. And I also think that I was really only exposed or educated on like Russian or Soviet forms of socialism and socialism in China. So again, this was a really new experience for me to see it in Cuba and see how it's different. In terms of understanding, how my understanding expanded after traveling to Cuba, I would say the most significant sort of impact was seeing it in practice rather in theory. So before I went, there were maybe a lot of socialist values that I identified with, but I just didn't have the frame to see what that actually looked like practically. And what was really striking to me was just to see an economic model that puts human well-being at the center of its purpose or its function, because obviously in a capitalist society we prioritize profit or capital accumulation. So just to see the way like the priorities of life are completely transformed within a different economic model, within a socialist model, was really impactful for me. And then another thing that I would say my experience taught me was, we spoke with an economist, Dr. Jordy, who was really incredible, really knowledgeable, and she shared a little bit more of the context of the challenge of socialism in the global market, right? So Cuba is not, I mean, it's an island, but like it's not an island. It exists in it exists in the global economy as well. And so one of the largest challenges is figuring out how to, maintain, preserve their socialist values while participating and being a part of this very competitive, largely capitalist world.
I'll just give a really good, just short response. It was really great. I totally agree with both of you. But going back to what Ayaan said, I think for my own personal idea of socialism, again, I've traveled to Cuba many times, so that the thought that I have about something, especially involving Cuba, always changes as I go, just as like Cuba is always different every time I go. And so I think even the first time that I traveled to Cuba, I'll say, I think it was very, very structured and very like, we want you to see this and we want you to understand this. And so when I went there, I'm like, oh my God, this is so perfect. This is socialism. Like it matched the idea of what I thought like social, like again, the extreme of capitalism, like everything's perfect, everyone has access. Oh my God, it's so amazing. And so it was super romanticized with like socialism and this idea of like, oh my God, this is perfect. I mean, I want to be here, I want to live here, I want to go here. This is like, I love it here. And so in each time I've gone, fortunately, like speaking with Dr. Jordy, the economist, who's like amazing, like I love her so much. And so the chipping away of that like idea and fantasy of like socialism has really been eye-opening and amazing for me. And I think just, again, in dynamics with the whole trip, or just with the theme of the whole trip, I guess, a struggle for me. Like going from like thinking this place is perfect and having this really great idea of socialism, but then understanding the embargo board, just understanding my like what are my own selfish like reasonings for wanting Cuba to be that for me, and like the escape of going away from capitalism and not having like such a politicized identity as a black person, even though it still is because I'm American in Cuba. And so like my idea of socialism has just really evolved into like just a really understanding that it's a struggle, and that it's a part of like everyday life, that it's not ideal, but like I mean same thing with like participating in capitalism. It has its pros and its cons.
All right. Well, as has been intimated, one of the most challenging issues was around race in Cuba. So this question has to do, as I think Ruby said, race is complicated in the Cuban context. So would y'all speak to some of the various ways Cubans of African descent explain their status in Cuba? And what were some of the most compelling explanations from your perspectives?
I like to just provide a preface of this.
Okay.
Definitely speak up. Right.
So the purpose of this delegation was to talk about like healing for Black women, like outside of like a U.S. context, but also understands the ways that like that U.S. like state sanctioned violence here against Black bodies also operates in Cuba against Black bodies, like through the embargo and blockade, and to understand those similarities, but to still like see that the Cuban people still enjoy their life, they still enjoy health, they still just get to experience joy, and what is that like and how can we learn from it was the purpose of the trip. I think what became a big focus of the trip unintentionally was the questioning or like the very like intense like critique of Black Cuban identity, whether they wanted to identify as Cubans or whether they wanted to identify as Afro-Cubans, and what was really underneath that. So I think that like again what I wanted the trip to be for got like sideswept by this big like racial like tension that became present, especially with people in the group of different like Black identities that didn't feel that they had space to like claim while we were there. And I had worked with the delegation. There was like a guide there that we had, a Cuban guide, and she said every time she has a Black delegation, whatever the theme is, this always gets brought up and surfaced and like just overtakes it. And so I mean we had, again, it was a lot of struggle. We had really good conversation. I'll say that the reason why I didn't want to focus on it so much, and still don't want to focus on it, because I feel like the beauty of like with Cuban identity and Afro-Cuban, like just even I think of them as interchangeable. My own personal, not they have their own ideas around it. Is that if you think of Cuba and you don't think of Black people, then you're not thinking of Cuba. You're not thinking of the real Cuba, because the history of Cuba is so embedded in Blackness. There's no separation of it. There's no question of it. Like the way that Cuba has even formed, like if you go into the history of Cuba, like as an island, it's Black slaves and the Taino indigenous people there, and even like poor whites coming together to like reform and to overthrow. And so like the mixing of the identity, but really grounded in like African identity and principles. Like you cannot like take African out of Cuba, otherwise it wouldn't be Cuba. You're not thinking about Cuba. And so I think that that's not like necessarily a focus. When Cuban people say I'm Cuban, I don't think that they're like erasing or negating their Blackness, but that like they have other like coming together under like a nation state identity benefits them in some ways than others, and getting into the weeds of it. I think that there's work to be done around it, but I can see the benefit, like understanding the history of Cuba and like going into like the revolution. I understand the benefit of coming together under a nation state identity that's still really grounded in Blackness and Africanness, that just can't be separated, because like they're doing really great work with like their healthcare system and their education system and like free thinking. That's more of a priority than spending so much time discussing their identity. I think that there's work to be done in that area, but it doesn't need to be a centerpiece, and that's what I really wanted people in the group to take away.
Other ideas?
I feel like I'll go next because I'll make it messy. So I feel like I always struggle with these type of questions because I think we're living in this really unique time where like black folks, we've always been talking across the diaspora, but now we have social media as a tool to like be messy with one another. And so I preface what I'm about to say with that. So one thing that really, I'm gonna derail and then I'm gonna come back, y'all. So Kofi Annan, does anyone know who that is? Mm-hmm. Okay, he recently passed, so now he's an ancestor, so I apologize for critiquing him while he's like no longer with us. But he recently came to McAllister, and the president of the school asked him what was it like being black during in St. Paul. And I got really frustrated because his response was like, I didn't really experience racism, and like maybe one time at the barbershop the guy didn't know how to do my hair, but like I really enjoyed Minnesota. And then the audience, which is mostly white, was like, interesting. And that was their perspective on what it was like to be black in St. Paul, right? And it just frustrated me because I just was like, yes, we're black, but like there's so many other factors that impact our experience of blackness, and you being someone who's coming here for an education that has a snapshot view of what blackness means here is not the same as someone from Rondo or someone who's lived in St. Paul, right? And who's gone through the unique discrimination of what it's like to be black in St. Paul. And so it's interesting that even though I'm saying this about Kofi, now I'm in the situation, right? Like, what is it like to be, like, black in Cuba? I don't know. I was there for 10 days, you know what I'm saying? And so, like, I'm recognizing that even within my blackness that, like, I need to also recognize my American privilege and how America, we have an understanding of, like, what blackness is here, and we try to impose that everywhere else. And so it's like, this is what we go through. We go to Cuba, and it's like we want to see all the parallels to be like, this is also like the U.S. And that was happening a lot, and I contributed to that. And I think also going to South Africa, what helped me was that a lot of black people put me in check, and they're like, we're not American. We're in the global South. Yes, you go through this and like there's parallels, but like we're indigenous here. That is a very different context than what you're coming from. And I had to like sit and swallow that. So I feel like in Cuba, a lot of those tensions were coming up, and I actually think that that's beautiful. Like I think that it's beautiful that we are a family that are like arguing at the dinner table because we're finally connected, right? Versus like before we weren't. And so I just think it was, yeah. So I feel like even in Cuba, I definitely understand that I cannot speak to what it means to be black. It was really complicated. We got a lot of arguments and a lot of intense conversations. I will say, though, that I get frustrated, though, that because when we talk about blackness and oppression, we focus so much on America, we do forget Latin America. We do. Like, and that's something that I feel like all over the diaspora we need to recognize. And even a great example is like Black Panther. Like Black Panther, like what about Latin America, you know? And so now that like Africans and like African Americans are talking more, we completely erase Latin America. And I think that there was recently an assassination in Brazil that people are still not talking about of a black woman. There's police shootings also in Latin America all the time. And I think what makes Cuba like really hard to talk about with race is that it is a part of Latin America, but it also has such a unique history that is specifically Cuban. And so we can't even, so even though I'm saying this about Latin America, I can't then like apply that to Cuba. But at the same time, I get frustrated that a lot of Cubans are like, we are Cuban, and racism is a mindset versus an institutional problem, but people make decisions in policy. Like people impact institutions. And so like for me, that was something that was really challenging for me. And I'm still reflecting about how complicated it is. But I think we're gonna talk about race, and also as like someone who's African American and African, it's like I'm trying to find the diaspora for hope, and I can't deny that like that's a lens that I have, and so yeah, there's gonna be tension. So we'll talk more about this during Q&A. It's like it's a whole thing.
Right. Yeah. So both Kalice and Ayaan touched on a lot of things that I was going to share. So I'll just add a little bit on that. Yes, I think our delegation struggled a lot with coming to terms with the fact that black is not necessarily a primary or core identifier for a lot of black people in Cuba, and learning more about how the revolution and their political history informs why they might identify as Cuban before black, or that sort of relationship between identity. And then I want to talk more about what Ayaan spoke really deeply about, which is this assumed commonality the black experience throughout, I guess, the diaspora, or we can be accountable and say of people who are black in America. I think that my experience as I'm Kenyan, I'm an African myself, and I think that sort of prepared me for encountering a situation where blackness is not necessarily important to me, although I am black and I'm African. There's a situation as well in Africa where people aren't necessarily going to identify as black because why? Like, everybody is black. It doesn't have the political function or purpose in Africa that it does in the United States. And so I think that it was a real challenge to have to be confronted with the fact that this assumed commonality is not always true, and it's not. I think it was really difficult because we were there to build solidarity, and so when you're trying to build in solidarity, but you're struggling to find that commonality, you have to be super intentional about what commonalities or similarities within black identity you are going to build on. And that is hard when our experiences are really unique and different. And then I just want to speak briefly to something Kalice said about, if you don't think about black people when you think about Cuba, you're not thinking about Cuba. One of the women that we met in a collective called Casa Tomada Mirarte, she said that because African identity or black identity is such so deeply rooted in Cuba, it is sometimes also erased or taken for granted because everybody can claim a little bit of it. There's black everywhere, and so it is political to name blackness or to name Afro ancestry, because even though African heritage permeates the society, it affects people in different ways. People who are more legibly black or more legibly African have a different experience in Cuba, and so for them to be able to name it and pull the African back out is something that she said was important to them as a collective.
And she also spoke to that institutional piece that Ayaan lifted up. And I'm wondering if you would respond to, we were talking about higher education at that session, and these were women who were educators who had struggled to get into the academy. And I thought it was very compelling in terms of some of the challenges that they faced, and some of the stereotypes as academics. I don't know if that stood out for any of you all. So all these things are going on at the same time, right?
Yeah.
So maybe one more question, and then we can open it up for the audience. I think you all have set a pretty compelling context to bounce off of. So do you have any, you reference healthcare, you reference education, any final observations about the society as it struggles against the blockade, but still continues to have a very deep and firm commitment to the humanity of all its peoples? So any final observations about how well they're doing that, what the challenges are, and where we might land with actually what the economists called market socialism, anyway.
I just want to say too that Cuba is such a contradiction. That you can ask one person one question, they'll tell you one thing, you can go ask someone else a question. They'll tell you the complete opposite of it. Like something that, and I think I had to like let that go. Each time I go there, I have to let that go. Because I'm like, no, Cuba's like this is it, this is that. And the next time I go, they're like, actually, this happened. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like, and it's not that, and that's even like within like things that we heard from different groups of people. Like some of the groups of people are like, we're Cubans. Like the group had like, this is the meltdown of the group. There was an educator that came in and she said, it was also all of this is happening through translation.
Which is another issue.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There was a mistranslation. It's hot. It's like 100 degrees.
Some translators are better than others.
There's no AC.
That's true.
We like are on a bus with no AC. Like it's rough. The whole thing is rough. So this is a melt. Like everyone had a meltdown. That's why I like brought like some Palo Santo, like to try to calm everybody down even before that. But it did not. It was terrible. So there's a mistranslation when this, and the translation was there's an educator talking about like how maybe black children are taught different in the education system. Ideally, there will be no difference. The saying is a Cuban is a Cuban is a Cuban. However, there could be other factors such as is one family of like Spanish descent because they have like a Spain passport that allows them to go out of the country, whereas black people, they don't have that same descent, so then they don't have a passport, they don't have roots to leave or to get resources. So their money from, if their families in the US or in Europe, they can send them money back to pay for, you know, more books or tutoring or more electricity. Like sometimes they don't have electricity, so like how can you study in the dark? So there's many different factors that go into it, but the saying is a Cuban is a Cuban is a Cuban. And when they come to school, the idea is that they're all the same school books because it's paid by the government, it's all the same uniform, all the same such and such. But other factors permeate that, right? The mistranslation was, there are no black Cubans. And when I tell you, the group was like,
They went
oh,
berserk.
like, people were like, what do you mean? Black Cubans? And I'm like, I just like sank in my seat. And that's not what she meant to say.
Right.
They don't, like, but people were like lost their minds. They were like, I'm going home. No, not that true. People like lost their minds. But the translation was that like, what do you mean like Afro-Cuban? Like we're Cuban, and that's the most important. That's what we cling to because Cuba has a really great like when they did they did a literacy campaign, and so it was to eradicate like illiteracy across the whole island. And so they're like, a Cuban is a Cuban. Like, if someone needs education, I'm going to help them. And the fact is, they do not count people as Afro-Cuban. In their sense, they don't count. Like, they're not looking for Afro-Cubans or Japanese Cubans. They're a Cuban is a Cuban. And so when people like heard that, they're like, she's erasing blackness, and she was like a white-skinned Cuban. So it was terrible.
Yeah, it didn't help. Yeah.
So like something that you hear one time, it's not the same thing that you're going to hear one time, but you also have to take it in the context of what's happening. And Cuba's always changing. Last time I went, like 1 year ago exactly, like from when the group was, I could go to the store. This time I couldn't go to the store. Why? Because policy changed because of the blockade. And so, again, Cuba is always evolving, always changing. But it's really important to know, like, the history of Cuba, to take in the greater context of what's going on. And to not, I think for me personally, not hold on to everything I hear. And that's something that I'm weary that people, like, who this is their first time, and hopefully it's not their last, but they were just like, oh my God, are there any black people here? I'm like, if they look black, like, I don't know, you see them. Like, and so it's just, it was a lot, but.
And speaking of that store that 45 has insisted that we can't shop in, that means we didn't get fans.
It was a fan store, y'all. It was a fan store, so we was hot. I had a fan though. I had a fan from last time, so we was hot.
Right. Anybody else want to just kind of add or bring this to a close? So our audience we can do some Q&A.
Yeah, at the very end, I just want to read, like, so this is a zine that we created. So I want to read one of my just like short little pieces I wrote in here. So I'll let you.
Oh, cool. While you find it,
Yeah, we can close out with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think for me, I think it's funny, but also like this is a sweet spot because I think if you are African American and you cannot decipher like where you come from, I think you're always looking for a sense of belonging, and so you're looking for Pan-Africanism too. And I think that needs to also be taken into consideration when we recognize that like that's why it's so hard, even though like it's funny, but also like in the moment it's really serious. And I think for me, I was prepared to understand that blackness was not going to be the main identity of people in Cuba, because my dad is African, and so for him, he is not black, he is Zambian. And we have challenges in the house about what does it mean to be black now that you're in this different context. When people look at you, they're not going to say you are a Zambian, especially a police officer. And me and my household, we have those conversations. And so I think I was more prepared then to go to Cuba and recognize people complicating what it means to be black versus a black American who does not have access to that. And so then if they're trying to seek out Pan-Africanism for a sense of belonging and home, and people are saying that a Cuban's a Cuban, I think like it makes sense why their feelings are hurt. And so I just want to like also like put that in the mix. Obviously our understandings of like what it means to be black in Cuba and race is different, but I just think it's also important. And so like for me, I'm really curious to talk about as well, like with y'all in the audience, like what can Pan-Africanism look like? What does it look like to heal as black people across different diasporas who have different traumas and experiences? And I think that is like what I'm hungry for after Cuba.
You want to close this out, really?
Yeah, so I don't have much to add. I totally agree with both Ayaan and Kalice, particularly in terms of educating yourself. And I'm just going to plug in my book club, because I came back from Cuba really wishing that I would have done more in terms of preparing myself for what I was about to learn. And so now that I've come back, and another thing we haven't really talked about is that Kalice did suggest we read Kindred by Octavia Butler before going, and we didn't speak much about that when we were actually in Cuba, but I came back from Cuba with a completely different sort of reflection on Kindred than I had before going. And so I think it's really powerful to be able to ground your experience or your learning in different texts, and I kind of wrote about that in the excuse me, in the zine as well. But I want to keep learning, I want to keep studying, so I was like, let me get this book club together. It's called the Freedom Ideas Literary Circle, and the first book that we're going to read is called Cuba, Neither Heaven Nor Hell, which I think is really apt. It's a really apt name to kind of succinctly describe the complexities of that island. And the book is a personal collection of essays by a Nicaraguan journalist who lived in Cuba, and kind of outlines her journey of like thinking about Cuba as this sort of utopia, and then uncovering a lot more the more time she spent there. So if you're interested, I'd love to have you join us.
When does the book club start?
Our first meeting will be November 3rd from 1 to 2 at the Daybreak Global Press Bookshop, which is on East Bank on Washington.
And Ayaan, could you say a little bit about the zine that you put together? And it's for sale, right?
Yeah, it's for sale, and so if you are interested in reading this and purchasing it, let us know after this. This was a part of a larger project to get people who typically don't see themselves as writers or artists or healers to do art therapy. So I also wrote this with 9 formerly incarcerated men. And so we all wrote out different stories. And so this one in particular is mostly about all of our kind of reflections on this experience and what does it mean to try to break the strong black woman curse and what we learned in Cuba to try to deal with that. So we'll talk about it a little bit more.
All right, let's give our panelists a hand. So the floor is open, and whoever wants to kick off with a question, please feel free to do so. See, several questions. Why don't we start with the two folk in the back row and go around to Professor Nips on the corner there. And you can introduce yourself.
Okay. My name is Manana. So in school, we're never taught that like blackness is associated with Latin American culture or Cuba in general. So I was wondering what you think contribute to the erasure of blackness in American history.
So with other forms of blackness in an American context.
Yeah, like what because you never learn that there's any like Black history in Latin American culture. Like in school, they never teach you that there's anything black about Latin America. And I want to know what has contributed to the erasure of that from American history and American schools, and why they never teach that.
Yeah, and then again, what I'm about to say is controversial because I feel like people are not going to agree, so definitely disagree with me. But I think it's like a byproduct of when we think of like famous like Latinx folks, like who do we think of? We think of like Jennifer Lopez, or like we think of people who are very pale, right? And like even in that, like even our imagination of like what Latin American like looks like is usually, it erases it in itself, right? And so for me, I went through a really similar thing. Like I'd never made the kind of like the association with like Blackness in Latin America until I started meeting more folks who self-identify as Afro-Latinidad, right? And then even that is complicated because in Cuba, a lot of people didn't like the term like Afro-Latinx or Afro-Cuban, right? And so one of my really close friends, she's Dominican. And she looks like me. We both have locks. And so when I saw her, I'm like, she's Black. And then she responded like, I'm Dominican. And then we all were like, okay, all right. And so, but this is on tape too, so it's like, I love you. Like, so, but I think it was beautiful because we got in a lot of like intense conversations, and that's what made me then understand more so like what that perspective is coming from. But we still disagreed, and I don't think that like, I think to answer your question, like really simply, is like we don't have contact. Like, and where she's from is from the Bronx, New York. So like even how like we became friends and I got to meet her was through college, higher education. But then even think about it, when we're in college, like UVM's big. So like what happens? Nigerians be over here, like African Americans be at BSU, and like, you know, like we like separate. So even when we are like amongst each other, we're in our own like groups of Blackness. But at McAllister, there was two of us. Like, I swear, so, like, we were forced then to, like, talk about what does Blackness mean in Congo? What does it mean to be be Black in Zambia? What does it mean to be Dominican? But I don't think that we have close contact like that, especially in Minnesota.
I would just add that, you know, in general, the way that the curriculum is colonized, you don't get anybody's history, really. The erasure, the deep distortion for those of us in the U.S. as well as across the African world. It just has not been a part of the way education has been constituted. And it's even rare at the level of the University of Minnesota. We've tried to do something in African American and African Studies, but it's still, you know, quite incomplete. So if you live in this country, you're not going to get very much substance about anybody's history. Next person. Next.
Hi, my name is Sandra.
Speak up just a little bit.
Oh, my name is Sandra. So I really resonated with what Ruby was saying about basically being African and not really, not necessarily identifying with being Black, but more so not really noticing that you are Black. Especially for me, I'm from Ghana, and in Ghana, you know, it's like you're Black. You know, you don't have to really say that you're Black because everyone else is Black. But one thing I know that a lot of Ghanaians struggle with and other Africans is colorism, and so it sometimes confuses me how you don't notice your Blackness, but you notice the shade of your Blackness.
Right.
And so I wanted to ask, in Cuba, even though there was something similar like that going on in terms of people not really identifying as Afro-Latina, but I know that their colorism plays a role. So what were your guys' experience with colorism, and how did you guys deal with it?
Do you remember the story that Carmen told us about when she got a job? Okay, tell that story then. We have lots of stories that people told us.
Yeah, so colorism is, I think, a global issue. Every, well, I won't say every, but many non-white societies, including Black and African
And
cultures.
Asian. Like that,
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
And so, yeah, it was alive and well in Cuba. And the story I was thinking, I can't remember really the specifics, but it was about Myrna, who, as Dr. Rose mentioned, spoke about her challenges as trying to enter institutions of higher learning, and she told a story about, I think she wanted to develop a African studies department or course or something like that in the institution she was working in, and the response that she got, and she was a dark-skinned woman, Myrna is, and the response that she got was like, why would we need any more Africanness when the intensity of your blackness is so strong? Do you guys remember that?
I remember
Did I tell
that
story?
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, it was really honestly disheartening. Like, it's just heartbreaking to me when I see, because I feel like, you know, I love Black people so much, and it's really heartbreaking when I think the like intra-community, the colorism, those issues really hurt me more than even white supremacy, which, you know, is related to white supremacy and it's related to colonization, all of those things. But it was really heartbreaking to hear all the ways that it does exist and take form.
And I just add something small too, that those type of issues in Cuba too are exacerbated, because you have like a tourist industry, so you have like European, American, and so they have this idea that like, so white people are coming to Cuba to tourist, and so that's a large part of their economy. So when you think of like who's going to get jobs, the idea is that like white people want to see like light-skinned white people too. So like those are people who get jobs, and our tour guide who has like, she's brown skin, and she talked about how she worked in like a tourist agency, and that like they had just like, everyone else was like white skin, blue eyes, like in the agency, and that was just like the norm. And like, so she had to work really hard to like keep her job, but to make a living so that she can support her family.
Yeah, but a Cuban's a Cuban is a Cuban, right?
Exactly.
So the contradiction, right?
Well, we said it's a complex layering of realities, and I think you all have done a really great job in trying to express some of that. But as someone said, you know, 10 days is not going to necessarily resolve all of these issues. Professor Nims, you were going to say something?
Just want to thank you all for going.
We were glad that we went.
It's fantastic, and I hope you can duplicate this with others.
Well, you know, you still direct the Cuba committee. We'll set up some. You can hear what's going on here.
You want to do more?
Yeah.
Traveling is crucial in interacting and learning, and I've been traveling to Cuba since about 1983, and I learn a lot. And listening to you, I learned a lot about Cuba because of your experiences. And you're right, you have to be very careful about not generalizing about Cubans and because everybody has their different. Just biographically, I'm originally from New Orleans. And so one of the things I learned very early in life, when I first came north, is that New Orleans has its own culture.
That's right.
Its own black culture. Now, I couldn't you can't generalize about African American culture. I realized there's a Minnesota culture. My good friend John Wright helped to educate me on the reality of there's a Minnesota black culture. So it's an important identity. It's constantly changing. And that's why we use this term, the social construction of identity. Yeah, it's not set in stone. It changes from one period of history to another. There's generational difference in all kinds of ways. The first time I was in Brazil, I was described as the white professor. I was by a black man. I was described as the white professor who's very dark.
That is a tough twist.
Yes. If you want colorism, there are over 200 different terms the Brazilians use to describe color.
Yeah.
And you're right, it's not just in Latin America. I was just listening to a BBC report the other night about skin lighteners in Nigeria.
Oh,
yeah.
pervasive.
And and all the problems health problems it's been causing the people. I have a theory about the identity question in Cuba.
And I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second. My apologies, but I have a class that starts at 1 o'clock. They have an exam, and they'll be very, very upset if I take off 1 or 2 minutes from their testing. But y'all are welcome to stay and continue the conversation. And thank y'all.
Thank
Love
you.
you. Can I get a much is this?
We're selling it 10.
Okay, I'll pay that, and then the book club. Let me see if we can. But go on, August, with your point.
Yeah, I became interested in this question of identity about 25 years ago. I started interacting with black and white Cubans. And the question would oftentimes come to me, why do you all African Americans, why do you all call yourselves African Americans? Why not just Americans? And to me, I started thinking, that's an interesting question. And why do we? And the fact that they were asking that question to me was also a very interesting question. And so I began to look into this, and one of the things I've concluded is that unlike the United States, black Cubans have a sense of ownership, a sense of ownership of the country that we just don't.
Yeah.
Well, my generation, when Malcolm X would say, I'm not an American, I'm a victim of Americanism. That was my situation. But in Cuba, when you go back and look at the history, the two wars of independence, people of African origin were in the key leadership. And it really hit me. I knew about sort of abstract until when I was in Santiago de Cuba on the eastern end of the island. And I'm walking down what is their equivalent of Constitution and Independence Avenue. And I started seeing these statues, and I realized they're generals. And about half of the statues were black generals.
Yeah.
About half of them. It's the only place, I think, in the world where you will find statues of black generals from the 19th century. And that's a part of the sense of, we created this country.
Yeah.
We fought for it and so on. And remember, and we African Americans, that's just not our history. This sense of ownership. I think it's changing. You know, maybe with the Obama generation, there's a sense of ownership and so on. But for much of African American history, this wasn't. But Cubans have this sense of real deep ownership, and I think it goes a long way in explaining this question why they see themselves first and foremost. And by the way, I was curious, did you all get a chance to talk to any Cubans who had been in Africa on any of the missions? For example, the Ebola mission last a couple of years ago, or had been to Angola, and get their sense of how they saw the African experience.
The first one. So we went visit this community group, and so also we talked to a pastor there, Pastor Izette, and so they've had like a new election, and so they're in the process, like they're gonna start like rewriting their constitution, and so like they have like work to do, and so like they don't got time to be arguing about Afro-Cuban or Cuban, like they got real work to do. And so when we were going around sharing, and we're saying like, yeah, we don't actually really get healthcare, like it's not free, like I have to go through this process. They're like, when we're telling them about the struggles of, they're like, isn't that in your Constitution? I'm like, I'm not even like a whole human in the original version of the Constitution. So like, no, it's not. And exactly to your point of like, that Constitution, that's theirs. They're rewriting it. Like that is like, that Constitution is like a part of it. Like that's their DNA made in that. And I do not feel that type of ownership. Like I don't feel that like my voice is in it. And like, there's so much, again, of the history. You really have to understand the history that you cannot extract blackness from Cuba no matter how hard anybody, which I think is very intentional, to like keep black people from, and that's like my next endeavor, like why black people don't know about Cuba, why are like Latin American black people forgot about, because like Cuban people, like they're, the way that social media like has such a potential to like to change things and help like them move forward the work that they want to do is just like it's so big, and that like that needs to be a movement in itself. So did you want to answer the second question about, did we talk to people who had traveled to like Africa and things like that?
Yeah, but just like to also add on to that, like I think another thing that I'm recognizing is like as Black Americans, we got a superiority complex when we go abroad that we also need to unpack. And even like in this panel, like I'm trying to like put my positionality in there and complicate it more to like address that. And I feel like what usually happens is like, okay, we're gonna go to Latin America to teach them what we're doing in America. And then they look at us like, you're not doing much. And it's a reality check. So like what you're saying about ownership, like even how that impacts how they imagine what politics and resistance can look like. You know, and even when I went to South Africa, they're like, you sit down and you read our books. You know, you sit down and look at what we're doing, because we got a lot to teach you. And you being comfortable with your ego and sitting down and listening. And I don't think like we always do that. And even in like our context when we went to Cuba, I think there was a little bit of that egoism too, where we needed to like take a seat sometimes.
There was a lot of that because everyone that we spoke to, like, so I can't remember, what is Dr. Jordy? She is like, oh yeah, I'm working on like my 3rd PhD, like, and had traveled all across the world, and someone had said like, they had said like, I think we're more advanced than like racial issues. I'm like, do you understand who you're talking to? Like, these people are like, so they're so much more educated than you, like so much more like understand like global, like
Yeah.
It was a lot of ego.
So then it relates to your question. So a lot of people did travel, and they were talking about what it was like to be, you know, teaching in like schools in like West Africa or East Africa and like a lot of that. And so they're constantly also contributing to helping African movements. And I think that's important too. Like, they're really much about Pan-Africanism and act that out, versus I feel like we as Black Americans can sometimes be so centered on us and not really thinking about how do we contribute to Black Canadians, to Black people in Latin America, to Black people in Europe, and like understanding that uniqueness that they're going through. And then the last thing I was gonna say is also, same vice versa though, I think that people do make a lot of assumptions about Americans at the same time. Like I said, I like contradicting myself, y'all. So I think there's an assumption that, you know, again, because I'm African and African American, both of my communities make a lot of assumptions about me and about one another. And so how can Pan-Africanism exist when, as much as I need to sit down and listen to my Zambian father, you also sometimes need to sit down and listen to my mom from Southside Chicago. And y'all got a lot to learn from one another. And then what would happen if we did on what we could build. And like, when we get there and social media can be the avenue where we get there, I'm so excited. That gives me hope as like living under 45. And so we need to like get there. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, particularly since this trip, how then, now that you've had this experience, how is it going to impact the work that you do, and like what do you see yourself doing with?
I'll answer real quick. I'm in therapy. That's what it means for me. I got back from Cuba and I'm like, you know what I'm gonna do? Not go to BLM, I'm gonna go to my therapist. Because if I am an activist and I'm overworking as a Black woman where people do not care about me, that is me being complicit to my death. Like, just straight up. Like, and I have to say it like that because people are not looking out for us, you know? And so when we went to Cuba, it was allowing us to learn about how we take care of ourselves because Black women there were doing it. And so now that I've seen it and I have a community, I need to hold myself accountable when I go back home. Even though I live in a capitalist place, I don't got the embargo, I don't got the blockade. So how do I take care of myself? And I think for me, that's what activism has to look like. And I mean, I work and I do social justice, but like, I want Black women to know that. And so like this piece for me, this zine project was about how do I use art therapy to be in my process of like healing. And I need to be alive to do the work, like straight up. And even people like just, I don't think, I'm worried about the psyche of like Black folks, specifically Black folks in Minnesota. I'm like really worried. So for me, I just want everyone to take care of themselves.
Yeah. I'm also gonna shout out the zine again because I think the piece that I wrote called Freedom Ideas, which is also why I jumped on that title for the book club. I think lays out the conscious transformation, my transformation in consciousness in terms of how I visioned Black liberation, because everything before I went to Cuba was informed by the Black American experience, or informed by like the limits of like what we don't have or what we can achieve. But like I wrote about how impactful it was to me to see Black divinity, like to see Black deities. Like I never saw, as an African even myself, I never saw anything like that. And like I just imagine like if I had grown up, or if this had been normalized for me, like imagine the like expanse of liberation I would have, because I write about how, you know, like how it affected how I imagine. I know like a lot of people use spirituality or religion, as a lot of Black folks do, to imagine their own liberation, but like how about here, right now, in your earthly body, like what capabilities do you have to do that, you know? So I think that's how my work has been changed or transformed.
Yeah, so like with Ayaan, I take a lot from Ayaan, like reading Too Heavy a Yoke or like Lose Your Mother, like really like re-grounding myself and thinking about like why this work is important to me. And I think that like maybe doing more delegations to Cuba, but like really being a good, people gotta read before they go. Like people gotta read. I have to say, hey, I know y'all didn't read nothing because y'all acting the fool here. Like y'all gotta stop it right now. And two, I think like really like building a movement. Like I'm interested in the work that you're doing, like how like traveling to Cuba as like a Black person and like learning, and like Minnesota Cuba committee here like is like moving policy here to like that's gonna impact Cubans there. And so that's what I want to do. I really want to like build a movement where like Black young people are connecting with Black young people there, because like Cuban people, they are like, again, like they're doing real work. And so I'm interested in building a movement here that connects to that movement to like elevate and lift that, and like really harnessing like social media, because that's one of their great, like Cuban, you can give them like a grain of rice, they will make like a meal. Like that, they're really gonna transform how social media is like used, and like really is gonna like can have such a big impact on society. So really building like movements and like continuing building that relationship is how my work is gonna go, but like grounding it in like why I'm doing it and not just to do it just to do it.
Yeah, and I think also like there's this whole initiative right now for like us as Black folks who've been doing radical work here is really making it international. And if it's not international and including other people as well, not only like for solidarity, but also again, like we can learn from them. I don't understand like why we struggle to acknowledge that. So then we understand, wow, this isn't working, why didn't we use this tool? So like going to Cuba, I really needed to go to South Africa before to like spiritually prepare me to receive what I got in Cuba. But if I would have gone to Cuba and not South Africa and got an awakening, I don't think I would have been able to experience it and like really receive it. So I think that's kind of something that I'm personally passionate about, is Pan-Africanism right now, and how student movements like young Black millennials are like trying to work together across these different borders and like saying skip borders.
I just want to say this.
Yeah.
Just here quick, I know you're waiting. Do you want to go quick? Did you have a question?
I know, like, here.
Okay.
Oh, sorry for interrupting. I just want to say like, thank you guys for presenting this. It was really beautiful. One of the questions that I have is like, you guys kind of touched on the idea that they kind of think like they know that we have a lot of work to do, and sometimes we don't realize that when we're going over there. What do you think are some of the things that are kind of missing from us? Because it seems like what I got out of this was like the wholeness of their humanity, like their reality, from the spiritual aspect to the political aspect, the legislative aspect, how much they recognize themselves and the power that they have. And I feel like as a Black person in America, that's kind of hard to do. But it seems like we are in the movement of trying to do that. What suggestions and tips and ideas did you guys bring back from your trip for us here? I know we want to think of ourselves as a global movement as well, but what do you think that we could be doing more to advance the cause here?
Yeah. I feel like, okay, like I know I've been making a plug for this like a couple of times, but I'm gonna say it again. So my favorite page in this zine is I was journaling a lot, right, to put myself in check and like really listen while I was in Cuba. And one of the pages, if I can find it, is literally like from my journal, and it's just of like my hands. Can y'all try to? I don't know. Right here. And something, we were like in this healer's like home, and he like told us that if you look at your hands and if you massage your hands, you're massaging your entire body. And so he was saying like in this part of your hand, that's addressing your heart, and this part is addressing like your like uterus. And I was just like, what? And he was just like he was just explaining like how to take care of your body, like just really simply, but in a way that was through a different lens. And that's why I think when I said when I came back, I just wanted to dedicate myself to really learning that, because we're not connected to our bodies. I feel like right now, like to be Black in the US, no matter like what your ethnicity or other identities you carry, we're in spiritual impoverishment. Like even if we are like religious or spiritual, because like you said, we're not able to tap into our complete humanity. So for me, in order to like reclaim that, it's been like getting back and centering into my body, like learning every part of my body. And so that's kind of what's helping me. I think another thing is like my grandma, when she grew up in Southside, like she didn't have access to the information that we have now, and so I've been like seeking out her wisdom, but she's no longer with us. And when I went to Cuba, there was this elder woman named Barbara, and this might sound like really weird, but I felt like I've been praying for my grandmother's wisdom, and it came through this woman in Cuba. And like I got so emotional, and like everything that I felt like my grandma would say in Southside was like coming through this like Cuban woman. And she, like, because of the embargo, like I was joking with her, I'm like, you have so much wisdom to give to young black women in the United States, like, can you write? And she was like, but like because of the embargo she can't. So I was like, you know what, we're gonna put you in this zine.
Yeah.
And so this is her handwriting like in the zine, and like so she's still with me, right? And like she's with us in this room. And so like I get emotional talking about her because like she helped me reconnect with my humanity in a way that I don't have access to here. And so it's like my next project is like I want to go back to her and have her actually write it, and that's going to be the new zine. Because I can't tell you what it's like being black in Cuba. Barbara can tell you. And then she can also tell you what we need to hear as black Americans because we're spiritually impoverished. Because she carries that wisdom, but she's not here, and the embargo fucking sucks, right? Like, so that's my next project. But like, there's a piece of her, and there's a piece of her healing for you to have today. And like, that's how I think about it right now. I know that's a lot, but like, I'm traumatized here. Like, people don't understand, you know, and I don't want us to feel that heavy all the time. And Barbara allowed me to feel light. And I'm determined to feel light also in the United States. As a black person, we deserve that. So, sorry for that.
No, I miss Barbara so much.
I know, like, Barbara, we love you. I don't know, but.
What exactly is that embargo? I think I'm confused.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Again, one of my missions to every black person I meet will understand what the U.S. embargo is. So, because of, so Cuba, again, y'all can feel me, I don't know all the facts stuff, but so it's essentially like a U.S. like blockade. So the U.S. has like, again, global power. And so essentially it's like saying that like no other countries can do trade with Cuba. And it limits Cuba's ability to like even like sell things. Like they have like their own like pharmaceutical company, like their own pharmaceutical like industry, but like they have really great like vaccines. I think one is like for like lung cancer or something, but they can't like get it out to people. Like even we would benefit from having that, but they can't do like it impacts their food. Like they have like one like pad or like tampon factory, so like they can only get like limited supplies. And so like when you go to the store, if there's like a soap that you like, it's here one day and it's not there. So they pay like so much like tax and fees for like such like little bits of like supplies, with food, with like clothing, with everything. Did you want to add to that from the Minnesota Cuba Committee, like how like it impacts? But like that's the gist of it. So,
But it's since the 1980s.
yeah, since the 1980s because of Cuba's like political.
Well, yeah, but like the big, the primary embargo was actually a physical embargo in the 1980s to cut off because they have relations with the USSR, or now Russia. And so basically the United States was afraid because of their proximity to us and that communism would...
It was never the real issue.
Yeah, it wasn't the issue. Like
that was the public
political
issue. That was the publicized issue.
And so you really have to understand the history. Like the U.S. basically has like always viewed Cuba as like this little playground, and like has always fought like since colonial times with like Spain and the British to like own and control Cuba because of its proximity to the U.S. And like use the USSR like political like as like devices to like really control and like essentially like suffocate. The idea is that the U.S. wants to suffocate Cuba society into like submission of like Cuba would like the U.S. would like place like government there. Is that okay? I think that's sweet. It's terrible. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Just wanted to give a plug for the Minnesota Cuba Committee. If you go to our website, there are a lot of resources on our website about the race question in Cuba, along with other kinds of issues. And one of the interesting facts you will learn is that around the question of education and knowledge about Cuba, there was a time when African Americans knew a lot about Cuba. And in fact, in St. Paul, Minnesota, in 1898, the black community in St. Paul actually staged an opera dedicated to a hero, a black Cuban hero named Antonio Maceo. And Maceo was such a hero to African Americans that many black families named their sons after him, and it became pronounced Maceo, but it was after Maceo. So in 18, he was one of the leaders of the Cuban Revolution, and so he was very much a hero for African Americans.
Maybe like one last question. I know.
Yeah, I gotta go to work.
Yeah. One last question.
Just a real broad one. Okay. There was slavery and then going into that. Okay, the slave owners said, we don't have the resources to develop this new country. Like Portugal is a real small country, and they wanted to develop Brazil as their colony. So some people say, well, the only way they could have done it was with slaves. But I wonder if that's true, or if there was some other system that they could use that couldn't so brutal as that.
Yeah. So your question is that, like before colonization, you're wondering if these societies would have been able to like advance themselves without slavery, is what you're asking?
Develop their colonies.
Develop their colonies.
Portugal,
Mm-hmm.
very small country, poor, and they had Brazil. And they didn't have the resources to develop Brazil, so they turned to Africa for slaves. That's what they said.
Yeah.
It
Could Portugal have still developed Brazil without slave labor?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to answer your question. Someone else can answer your question.
Yeah, so I-
my idea is that they should have just stayed out of Brazil because they had people there already that were like, they have their own technologies and have their own societies. Like, so like Portugal didn't have no business in Brazil. And like, just like the British like didn't have any business here because we're, again, the U of M is on stolen Dakota land. So like this is not our land. Like they had entire like nations and societies here. And so I don't think the question is like, could they have developed Brazil without, I don't know how to answer the question, but for me it comes from like, could they have developed without slave labor? It's like they didn't have no business there. But can someone else answer the question of, could Portugal have?
I feel like, can we just hear like really
I
quickly
have
what you want to
a
say?
major question. Where does the idea that Portugal was poor come from? Portugal was one of the wealthiest European countries because of their forays into Africa, because they inserted themselves as middlemen in Africa in the already established trade routes. Once they did that, they exploited Africa for slaves to send to the colonies. Then how does a poor country in Europe get to South America, have the power to explore? All right, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, how did they have the money to do that? They're the ones that started the scramble and started the race because of the fact that they went into Africa, they became the middlemen, they diverted the trade routes from the north of Africa and the Arabs. Once they got that wealth, they wanted to expand their hegemonic dominance. They created the race to colonize the world amongst the Europeans. They were not poor. Poor people don't set out into the ocean with thousands of ships and colonize foreign areas. That is fundamentally a false fallacy. That's not how it happened.
That was a really great, thank you.
Yeah.
That's how I want to end it though.
Yeah, and I just want to like do something intentional to close because we have to go to work, and I know y'all probably have to go to different things too. That's again the theme of lightness instead of leaving here feeling heavy, because talking about colonization and these things can be very heavy, especially if you come from someone who's been colonized. So I don't necessarily know exactly what we can. Well,
I want to read what I.
Okay, cool, yeah.
So again, I will always Cuba will always have a special place in my heart, and I will continue to visit and continue to learn from Cuban people. Like I'm not going there as like, oh, I have something to teach them, but that they have something to learn that I want to build with them, in whatever way that looks like that's most helpful. So this is what I wrote in the zine about like how I feel about Cuba, and just as a Black woman. So I don't feel like nobody loved Black women, and because of that, we need to love on ourselves. I itch to get back to Cuba. Literally, like I have a bug. I cannot seem to stay away I crave Cuba, like a girl misses her lover's kiss. I love Havana's hot, sticky streets, like a kid loves the ice cream man. When I think of Cuba, my body remembers the feeling of freedom, of dancing, of laughter, so much that it hurts. I didn't know I had that much joy. The I love being black type of freedom, the run away and never look back type of freedom. And that's how I feel about Cuba. I always feel that way.
So thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming.